We are not going to get out of this unscathed. I am agreeing with Harry Dent. If we see 2024 come and go like 2023 did, then he and I and anybody who understands basic economics and economic theory and policy and what happens when you overstimulate and you can constantly stimulate your money supply without ceasing, and you don't allow your markets to naturally sweep clean the bad decisions of debt and overcapitalization. Welcome, Crashers and Taxes family. I am your host for this podcast, Rebecca Walser. So glad that you are joining me, and you'll have to excuse everything. I'm obviously really in a casual get-up today, and that is because I have been, and I didn't even do a podcast last week, and that is simply because I have been traveling so much at the beginning of this year. It was kind of almost not looking forward to 2024 starting, only because I knew I was going to literally be gone for like 5 straight weeks of travel. And that's difficult, and that's a lot. But all of the groups that I am affiliated with, and I'm sorry about this hat, but it was one of those days. It's a bad hair day. And so here you go. But to go back to my point, all of these launches at the beginning of the year of all of the various things that I do that I'm affiliated with, and then all the content production that my team and I are responsible for getting out, just really made the first of the year super busy. I've been going nonstop. And of course, I went to Phoenix, and anytime I go to Phoenix in the winter, I always get sick. I don't know what it is about that city. I don't know what's going on. I had a local once explain it to me about male and female trees. I won't bother you with the story. But the point is, literally every time I go to Phoenix, I get sick. And I had to have my blood work drawn. I'm really someone who can't stand needles. Like I can't, like the hospital and needles. That's like my kryptonite for sure. Like when my kids were getting their vaccines and stuff, I literally would have to stand outside in the hallway and have someone else in with the kids, because I melt. I can't take the doctors, the hospitals, the needles. So like I avoid blood work at all costs. And my doctor, who knows me extremely well, she saw my blood work, which I got done while I was sick, only because I had put it off like 3 or 4 times before. So I was like, I don't even care. I've got to get this blood work done. And she literally said she could tell I was under viral attack with my white blood cell count and all of my all the other things that she said. And I was like, that's amazing, because I didn't say a word to her about it. And she's like, I could totally tell you were sick. I'm like, but I had to get that blood work done. You were going to kill me if I said once again that the blood work was not done. So the bottom line is, because of all this, I was so sick last week. I didn't do a podcast. And plus I was traveling. And this week I have had the first week of 2024 where I have not been on a plane. And even though I'm still a little teeny bit under with the cough drops and everything and my hot tea, I am doing so much better. So I wanted to make sure that I went ahead and recorded Crashes and Taxes this day, Friday, February 9, even though, I still don't feel super great. And so I'm just going to talk through this podcast with you. I did not do slides today because really some of the things I want to talk about are just, they're not slide material. And honestly, I think that the American public needs to understand why we didn't have necessarily a crash last year, and why this 2024, unfortunately, we won't be able to escape one, given present day boots on the ground data and circumstances. So the first thing I want to talk about is, and I've said this to you guys before, but I want you to make sure that you understand that economically speaking, the way it really works in modern society, and by modern society, I really mean post 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and basically has most favored nation status because they're an emerging country. Even though they really truly have surpassed the United States economically. So, all that being said, we need to understand what is happening and why. First of all, from just a global perspective of macroeconomics, we have 2024 as a reckoning year. However, we will then diverge into geopolitics, and we'll talk about how that also has an impact. And I think we'll end probably with that. And I also want to very briefly, so it's three-pronged show today. I want to very briefly explain to make sure that you guys are understanding why the banking crisis that is still upon us is about to heat up, and how and why it is going to affect the entire banking industry top to bottom. And there will be no groups that escape. There will be no too big to fails this time, and I'm going to explain why that is. So let's start with China. China is imploding as we speak. Their stock market has literally lost. It is a self-implosion of their markets. And so much so that China has already come out and said in January of this year that they will pivot policy and start to re-stimulate their economy. This is the government stating this directly, the CCP. And yet their stock market has still not really stopped sort of its free-for-all. This is in part because in a Hong Kong court, we have Evergrande, which is the largest property manager in the world, forced into liquidation. Now, I need you to understand how long this has been an issue for Evergrande, because I was literally in London in one of my MBA classes at the London School of Economics in 2020. I'm trying to remember if it was the fall of 2020, I want to say. And that was where we got notification for the first time that Evergrande was going to, or Evergrande, depending on how you say it, the Chinese say Evergrande, that Evergrande was going to miss its bond interest coupon payment for the first time. And that was in the fall of 2020. And at that time, we were literally visited by one of the ministers of finance from China, because it's a global program, and they had, it was that level of connection, and still is. We had a Ministry of Finance of China visit one of the ministries, and ministers, I should say. And basically he stated that, and this was again 4 years ago, almost this fall, he stated that, he did not believe that it would that Evergrande, one, would eventually collapse, and two, if they did, he did not see it as an overall contagion impact to the entire Chinese real estate property market. Well, it's taken 4 years to almost, a little under, to finally get Evergrande into liquidation. So that can tell you why things have seemingly taken so long to come to fruition, to come to where the economy truly is. We have a huge disconnect between the underlying economy globally and the stock markets, except for in China, where their market has routed. I mean, we're talking about a 60% free-for-all correction, crash, whatever you want to call it. And the government is stepping in and saying they're going to fix it. And guess what? So far, not fixed. So if you're wondering why all of these prognosticators and these contrarians, and Harry Dent really should go out and look and watch his interview with Kitco News that he did this past week, because he calls himself the contrarian, meaning he is the deepest contrarian there is, according to him, in the United States. And he literally stated, and I feel his pain, I feel his frustration in this interview that he did with Kitco. Basically, he stated, if we don't have an economic reckoning in 2024, then it will be the first time in the history of recorded time globally that we have stimulated as much as we've stimulated. We've never stimulated as much as we did with coronavirus, ever, nowhere even close. It will be the first time we've stimulated as much as we stimulated, and we do not have a price to pay for it in terms of an actual stock market pullback, correction, or i.e. crash. And he said, and this is Harry Dent again, he said that if it doesn't happen, if 2024 is not a reckoning year, as it absolutely should be, because of course he believed that 2023 was going to be the reckoning year. He said if it is not a reckoning year, that frankly, that he will get out of the business that he's in, that he's been in for his career. And he said that, and I totally understand where he's coming from, because he said, I won't have anything to contribute anymore, because real, true economic viability of policies, economic policies, monetary policy, fiscal policy, all of that will have proven completely untrue. And really what he's saying is MMT, modern monetary theory, which is the idea that the government can print incessantly and forever without any repercussions. What he's really saying is MMT will be proven right. And all of us, Milton Friedmanists and Adam Smiths, and those of us that really believe in true invisible hands, and that you cannot fake economics, and that eventually economics and economic theory will bear out. He's saying if it doesn't, because what real economic theory and policy bearing out means is 2024 is a reckoning year, that we will have this correction. Then he said he's going to get out of the business. And basically what his point was, and I 100,000% agree with him, what his point was is that we have not been allowed since 2008, we have not allowed our markets to fail. And he's right. We have literally had many bailouts since Too Big to Fail, since 2008. And it's just like exactly what I've been saying when we switched monetary theory from, more a Friedmanist monetary theory to really Keynesian modern monetary theory, and that we can just print and print and print. And so I thought about that for a moment, and I thought, why is that? Why has the Federal Reserve worked double overtime to make sure that we don't have any kind of recession, market correction, or anything really since 2008? But then when you look at 2020 and beyond, the stimulus that we had in 2020 in the United States, which is the equivalent of 10 trillion US dollars, and the rest of the world printed another, in their currency is the equivalent of another 10 trillion of US dollars, but in their domestic currencies. Basically, what I realize is we are at the point, because we switched to MMT, and MMT is literally a house of cards. It keeps stacking more and more and more and more. If you have the bottom of the stack of cards start to wobble, then the entire, like Jenga, the entire stack, the entire deck is going to implode upon itself. So I believe that the reason that we have not seen the Federal Reserve be open to allowing our markets to really correct naturally in the organic process of the absorption of all this excess capital would naturally lead to, because the excess capital comes into the market and 100,000% goes straight into literally the market. In fact, if you extract the money supply, which is M2, from the stock market, if you do an analysis and you run the stock market from 1929, the Great Depression, to present day 2024, February 2024, and you overlay the M2 money supply, and then you extract the money supply, what you'll see is that stock market is actually at a lower level than it was in 1929, meaning that we really haven't had true return over the years since the Great Depression, that we've really had just economic Federal Reserve or monetary policy return. And as the stimulus comes into the economy, it eventually and always ends up in the stock market. And of course, owned by the richest of the rich in the global world. So you're literally talking about a trickle up, a reverse, like the 401k dollar cost averaging millions and millions of Americans that are buying into their 401k with their salary deferrals every single month. It's going from the masses to the corporations that, are owned and run by the billionaires. So it really is a trickle up economy back to the billionaires. And this is, in fact, why the billionaire class became super more wealth concentrated post coronavirus 2020, even though the stimulus was given out to everybody. And that's kind of the American problem, right? We do not save at all. We have a 22 trillion estimated wealth gap. And we're talking about retirement wealth gap. So what that means, I'm not talking about the wealth gap between the top 1% and the bottom 99. That's a whole nother wealth gap. I'm talking about the wealth gap for retirement, and that we should have put away 22 trillion more assets than we currently have if the people that are going to retire in the next 20 years are to maintain the same lifestyle that they had while working. So in other words, we don't save anywhere near enough. We are a consumption-based economy, and we finance our current consumption even over what we're currently making with debt. And that's the problem. The United States in 2024, the United States federal government will spend more on interest servicing of the debt than they will spend on Medicare spending and the defense spending, not combined, but separately. It is more than what we're spending on defense or military, and it's more than what we spend on healthcare. What? So back to Harry Dent, basically saying if 2024 is not a reckoning year, he expects to just get out of this business, because what he's saying is that they will have finally proven that MMT does work, and it is possible to have zero consequence printing dollars over and over and over, and he won't have anything to contribute anymore, because all of the systems and every economic theory that he's ever lived by and I've ever lived by will be upended and turned on its head, and it will be false, and there will be no more reason for people like him and people like me to even be in this business to prognosticate, because we will have been wrong and we will have been proven that MMT can and does work. Now, of course, this is not going to happen, because we understand that we are already seeing the lag effect finally be realized. What is the lag effect? The lag effect states, and I did this in a podcast, I think in December, on crashes and taxes. The lag effect simply states that it is about a year and a half from Fed policy shift to actual market impact. So when the Fed started raising rates in June of 2022 and concluded the raising of those rates to the 5.2555 Fed funds rate on July 26, 2023, that was our last rate hike. And then since then, all of the FOMC meetings have been pauses where they've held. And of course, now the discussion is, when are they cutting? And so what you're seeing is finally the lag effect starting to be realized. And what we're seeing that very clearly is with China and with the Chinese stock market and the implosion of the Chinese stock market. Now, from an economic perspective, what we say is what happens in America happens first in China or Asia, we say. So first Asia is impacted, then, and the reason is, and okay, let me explain why. Then it moves to Europe, and then from Europe, it moves to the United States. Why would this be? It's very simple. The Asian world is our supply chain. They are our suppliers. So as soft economic indicators start to trickle to the down or to the negative side, the first group that feels it are the groups that make the orders, that produce the orders, because what you'll start to see is a reduction in order flow. We are going to have less orders. People are going to be consuming less. There'll be less car or orders that'll be coming over because the car market is imploding in America, which is another whole thing. So you'll start to see that the orders and the requests for what we need to import start to drop. Of course, that impacts the Asian market immediately, because you've got, per capita GDP, some of the lowest numbers outside maybe some of the African countries in Asia, because this is again where, or used to be where, goods were very cheap to produce, a lot cheaper than they were with the labor laws in America. And so everything was outsourced again to mostly China and Asia. So it makes sense that as we start to see economic weakness, that the Asian markets would see it first, because they are the manufacturer. Then we start to see it in shipping, and global shipping starts to drop. Then we start to see it when we have geopolitical conflict, like in the Red Sea with the Houthis and them potentially attacking private carrier ships. We have Maersk, the second largest shipper in the world, basically saying they won't be able to send their ships through the Red Sea until this gets resolved. And even after America added some, protectionist boats over, Maersk is still saying no. We are not going to take this chance. So that you've got an increase, then it's a weird split, because you have a lower demand for global shipping because orders are coming down. However, you have a problem with shipping through the Middle East and the Red Sea. So then you have those inflationary costs. And certainly if the ships have to go around the Horn of Africa to get over to the other side of the world, this is going to increase shipping costs astronomically. Now you look at Germany and you look to see what is the status of Germany. And we know that Germany has been in a manufacturing crisis, depression level manufacturing levels, literally for the last 6 months. And, as Germany goes, so goes the EU, because Germany obviously is the strongest of the manufacturing base in Europe. And the UK, which would be the financial center of Europe, even though they're no longer a part of the EU, they have left the EU. So we're also going to start seeing more problems in Europe. And then all of that to say that the problems will eventually rest here in the United States, and we are just not seeing them yet. And it's very frustrating because, just like Harry Dent's frustration, that I felt his pain so much, when we start talking about, black swan events, things that we expect geopolitically to happen this year, things that we expect economically, monetarily to happen this year, I get all kinds of comments back from everyone saying, Rebecca, are you insane? The market is hitting all-time highs. The market's doing great. And it's just so sad. It's so sad that we Americans can actually have that opinion, because what you need to understand is, go back and look at all of the major crashes that have happened and what the market has done right before those major crashes. Just look. So the S&P had such a hard time with resistance, with hitting a new high. We didn't hit, even as great as 2023 ended, we never hit a new high in the S&P. But since 2024, we've hit a new high 8 times since 2024. So this is the phase of time in the market that we like to refer to as irrational exuberance, coined, of course, by Alan Greenspan with the .com crash, because we had the same thing. Man, the freaking market hit the highest highs ever. We had the first tech boom, Amazon, Facebook, these things that were coming out, Google, Alphabet, Google search engine. Literally, I remember being introduced to that, I believe, in 2001. This was our first tech boom and our first tech crash. And look to see the time frame. Look to see what happened in 2007 before the crash of 2008, too big to fail. Troubled asset relief program. So I say all this to tell you that you cannot reply to me that the market is hitting all-time highs, and actually think that actually communicates a valid economic point, because the market will hit irrational highs in these kinds of circumstances when the whole world economically, from Asia to Europe to the United States, because if you look at the January jobs numbers, even though we had wage growth and job growth, total wages for the month actually went down in January. And you ask yourself, why did wages go down when wage growth went up and jobs went up? And it's because they cut the hours. And this is always what they do. When they don't want to let go of their people, they had so many such hard times in 2020 after coronavirus restaffing. And I can attest to that as an employer myself. I had the worst time ever in the entire business I've ever lived through of finding qualified people and having them wanting to come into an office, even with a hybrid schedule that we have, and to work. It was extremely difficult. So what you have as employers that aren't, they're giving people hourly raises. They are keeping the people employed, at least right now, though we have seen some softening in those, and the layoff numbers have gone up astronomically, but they are cutting hours. And we can overlay Fed charts from the Federal Reserve that basically, St. Louis Fed, that will basically show us that as hours are cut, that literally demand drops and we start to move into recessionary times. So I don't believe that we aren't going to have a crash. We are going to have some kind of market correction crash. And I'm with Harry. If it doesn't happen in 2024, then we're wrong. We're just both completely wrong. But you can't trick economics forever. And I think this is why Powell went on 60 Minutes this past weekend on Sunday to really explain that we are not going to just bail out and continue this cycle of cheap money and stimulus, because there is a reckoning and there is an endpoint to that. And, you know, we haven't hit it yet, but good God, if we did hit it, it would be very scary. You look at the 10-year recent Treasury auction, that was fine, but the 5-year was quite ugly. So we're starting to see some indications in our auctions that maybe our paper is not really what people want anymore in the global world. And why wouldn't it be, right? Because if you think of the United States dollar as the global singular global reserve currency, which it is, you have this belief, as many Americans do, but then you have to look that our Forex holdings, our foreign exchange reserves that are held in US dollars in the United States or in the world is dropped below 60%. It's in the 50s. So we are not that hegemonic status that we used to be. Which brings me really to the geopolitical points and away from the economic points and the economic data, because the economic reckoning is coming. It's not really stoppable. But what is happening geopolitically? And that really brings me to this Tucker Carlson interview with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. What an interesting interview. Truly fascinating, but so disappointed in the media of the United States and preventing that message. So, you know, you can go to tuckercarlson.com and watch it directly at his website. And obviously it's also on X, as Elon Musk has made the commitment to Tucker to not censor the interview. However, if you go to other mainstream dissemination channels like YouTube and others, you'll see that the interview is not available due to violations of their privacy policy and their terms of service. And I just thought to myself, you know, what kind of nations over the history of time have prevented their populaces from hearing information? And when you look at the kinds of controlled societies where the governments decide what information their people can and cannot hear, you really start to see that they are controlled societies. Certainly the CCP in China, the Communist Party, has a great handle on the internet content. So much so that I think there was a global, was it the Olympics, but there was a global financial conference in Beijing in the last 3 or 4 years. And I distinctly remember the Western journalists just being absolutely shocked that they weren't able to get to certain domains on their internet browser because of the lockdown of information that occurs through the Communist Chinese Party. We saw a little bit of this in 2020 when the virus came out and certain doctors were questioning, you know, certain therapeutics that potentially could viably help, and that was shut down immediately on multiple platforms, including Twitter, X, Facebook, and YouTube. So you have to stop and ask yourself, why does this federal government and the, you know, powers that run, you know, information services like YouTube, which is supposed to be, you know, a platform upon which people can insert their content regardless of their viewpoint, why are we in America for the first time really starting to be told that we can't hear what the president of another foreign superpower in regards to nuclear weapons, a nuclear superpower that we are engaged in a conflict with since literally March of 2022 via our Ukrainian as a proxy, because we have sent Ukraine 60 over $60 billion. I believe that the entire war effort has cost over 160 billion, of which the United States has definitely sent the Ukraine 60 billion, might be higher. So if we as Americans are being told that we need to continue to support the effort against Russia via Ukraine, why are we not being allowed, or at least they're trying to prevent us from hearing what the leader of this other foreign superpower with nuclear weapons believes, is saying, is talking about, wants to tell us about the conflict, why it started, why it's going on, how it started, why, what? We aren't intelligent enough to hear a global leader talk and make our own assessment and our own opinion, form our own thoughts around whether or not he is a total creep, a jerk, who is, someone who was KGB and literally is, assassinating people all over the world. We can't decide that for ourselves, or whether or not he seems to have shifted in his global geopolitical strategy and his economic strategy. And the most interesting thing from an economic strategy perspective that Vladimir Putin shared with Tucker was how much transactions and what percentage of transactions occurred in Russia in US dollars prior to March of 2022, and then post of March 2022, when they were kicked out of the SWIFT international payment system, how much in trade is now being done, not only in their domestic rubles, but also in the Chinese yuan. And basically, Putin told Tucker Carlson directly, your country is stupid because they weaponized the dollar. They kicked Russia out of the SWIFT payment system. And what they have done is basically leapfrog the process of de-dollarization globally, because they pushed Russia to trade very closely with their neighbor, China, and develop this BRICS bloc that we've been discussing incessantly for 2 years. We created a warp speed transition of countries, specifically the BRICS countries, to de-dollarize because we kicked Russia out of the SWIFT payment system. Now, I'm not saying that China hadn't done had already undertaken massive effort to make the Chinese yuan their Belt and Road Initiative, the infrastructure initiative, the foreign direct foreign aid, and everything that they've done with all the countries they've done it with to really start to exert their Eastern dominance. But what we are clearly in now is a multipolar world. We're no longer unipolar with just the West at the top of the heap. And when I say the West, I'm talking specifically about United States, Europe, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. That is the bloc of the West. When you hear foreign policy experts discuss the opinion of the world, most of the time they are just referring to those countries I just mentioned, the West. But what we see now with the BRICS bloc is that the bloc of BRICS nations, and I'm going to put Saudi Arabia a pin in it for just a second, the bloc of BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, United Arab Emirates, Iran, as of January. Saudi Arabia had a formal announcement by the BRICS bloc that they joined, but then Saudi Arabia has actually retracted that themselves by stating publicly that they are still in the process of assessing all of their international agreements and deciding whether or not they actually can join the BRICS bloc. If you look behind the scenes of what's happening with Saudi Arabia, they are in the midst of, and have concluded some, but are still in the midst of negotiating some major contracts with Lockheed Martin, which is obviously a US-based global defense contractor. And I think that they are just waiting and biding out time to finalize these final contracts with Lockheed Martin, of which some will be produced actually in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia will be actually assembling a part of the Lockheed Martin product in Saudi Arabia. So I think that they are looking to conclude those contracts, and then it is a matter of time that they will obviously be an official part of the bloc. And this is the scariest thing to us as America, because it's the petrodollar agreement that was done by Henry Kissinger and the King of Saudi Arabia in 1974. It's the petrodollar agreement that really gave the United States the backstop of a hard asset, or at least a quasi-hard asset backing, when we completely came off the gold standard under Nixon in 71, which had caused inflation and all these things. So we're talking about the viability of the continuation of the petrodollar ending at some point. But what Putin expressed to Tucker Carlson was the fact that the BRICS bloc now, the GDP of the BRICS nations now exceeds the GDP of the G7. The GDP of the BRICS countries exceeds now the GDP of the G7. And what this indicates is that the world is moving towards the East and towards this bloc and away from the West. And we did not help ourselves by basically weaponizing our US dollar. And I think that the economic point that Putin made in that section of the interview is exactly what the American government does not want its people to realize. Because when you have another foreign power leader, a nuclear superpower, stating that I basically de-dollarize my country down to this much in US dollars through the Black Sea and transactions in the Black Sea, and I wasn't doing that until I was kicked out of the SWIFT international payment system, and basically, sanctions were put on everything. And watch that part of the interview. Wow. You realize that, we are self-inflicting the beginning of the non-use of the US dollar in multi-global transactions. And remember that the US dollar is only bought by China and Japan, our two largest purchasers, Japan first, then China. Japan first holder of US debt, and China second holder of US debt, outside of the US as the largest holder of our own debt at $34 trillion. When you realize that we self-inflicted de-dollarization, and that it is happening at such a fast clip that our Forex reserves are in the 50s globally, and that the GDP of the BRICS bloc and the nations that are going towards the BRICS bloc already exceeds the GDP of the G7, including the United States, the UK, Germany, a lot of Japan. I mean, a lot of, wow. So we have the geopolitical risk of the Chinese basically seeing that under this administration, for whatever reason, there is weakness, and Russia invaded Ukraine in February, March of 2022. You have China surrounding Taiwan with military drills and basically stating publicly, we consider Taiwan still a part of China. You have the Middle East happening between the Gaza Strip and the Palestinians and these Jews, the Israelis. That's happening. You have the Red Sea problematic shipping problems. So these are all the geopolitical risks that we have. Two articles came out this week, and it's stuff that I've been discussing for years now. And it's definitely what we would call in the group of irregular warfare. And specifically, with the Chinese spy balloons that we had last year, those 3 spy balloons that we had over the different parts of the year, you see that China is basically forecasting that they are preparing for, irregular warfare against the United States in the form of cyber attacks. Now, when most people hear cyber attacks, they think, okay, they're going to hack the internet, they're going to get our personal data, and they're going to have all this information about us. No. They already do that with TikTok. They're already tracking how many millions of Americans on a daily basis, what their daily routine is. You get that app, and you have that app on your phone, and it basically is a GPS signal reporting back to China of where you are all day long, how many times, what you're in, what you're doing. It is a tracking mechanism as it is. And it's interesting because they have a propaganda campaign going on right now in America about TikTok. And it's like, it's just, I think it was like a nun. Yes, absolutely. It was a nun on their commercial, basically saying that she lives to support others, and she's dedicated her life to this mission, and that she uses TikTok to achieve her goals every single day. And I just thought to myself, it's true. You can use any nefarious tool for the good and for a positive. And God does this all the time. He says that, he will, I think it's Romans 8:28. He works all things together for the good for those that love him. So yes, can TikTok be used as a good tool? Yes, absolutely. However, that doesn't mean that it is a tool that we should have as an app. And I don't think TikTok will ever go anywhere, but I'm just stating the obvious here. So China's already really far into surveilling us as Americans and what our daily lives look like and what we're doing. This is not that. This is not them hacking. This is not them, this is them doing two things. One, they want to malware attack our electrical grid. Our electrical grid is one of the worst in the world of first world nations. We're talking about no upgrades, no major capacity increases, no resiliency, backup, processes in place for when, Texas is in a snowstorm. None of, like, our electrical grid is no longer first world status as far as I'm concerned, and super, super exposed to a potential cyber attack. And the problem is the cyber attack with the archaic and elderly nature, antiquated nature of our electrical grid. The expectation is a successful attack could literally take our grid down for weeks, if not months. So that is a problem, because I live in Florida, and when we have a hurricane and there's no power at my house for 4 days, we have a generator and we're turning the generator on. We're running at least part of the house and part of the appliances. But, you can only do that for so long. And I know on the fourth day of not having any power, I'm getting really, really, really annoyed. And I'm starting to think, where can I leave and go stay until this power comes back on? A modern society that is running on electricity is inept and literally just leveled flat of effectiveness when they do not have their electricity. Not to mention all the EV cars that wouldn't be able to be plugged in, that wouldn't be able to run, and so on and so forth and so on. So first of all, it's a malware attack, specifically being advertised by the Chinese sources for our electrical grids, but it's also an attack of the internet and disruption of domains and stealing of data and that as well. It's both, but it's really more on the electrical grid side. And I don't think people realize this. There's been chatter that, we might even potentially see the first of the attacks beginning with the Super Bowl Sunday, which was Sunday, February 11th, this Sunday. But this podcast will be out after the Super Bowl because I'm recording it on Friday and my producer has to finish producing it. So, something that potentially could happen in Vegas globally with the eyes of the world on the Super Bowl in such a transition year of both geopolitical and economic situations is not unanticipated. In fact, it's very much anticipated and almost expected. And so you can see that. We also have some really crazy weather situations happening in California. And that, I believe, is going to be some big news this year as well. Something with the weather in California specifically. I know that, there's a lot of people that follow California specifically for the earthquake, the big one. They think that has been due, and we haven't had one for over 100 years. So that's another potential situation that would really send the beginning of 2024 into a tailspin if it starts pops off right now. So I just want to tell you, there's a lot of risk factors beyond just the global economic risk factors that we are fully experiencing now. There's the geopolitical risk factors, and there's the risk of, the fact that America in an election year has become a lot more of a closed society, and they're trying to control information a lot more. Of course, we've seen in federal court cases how much this Biden administration has been in touch to censor information off of the social media channels, which again, why do we have any kind of government situation trying to control information? That is always associated with a more closed political system, not a democracy, not a republic. So I think we need to think about that as well. And then the final and third thing I wanted to discuss today was the banking crisis and how it is going to affect the banks from top to bottom in this country, and how people are not prepared and don't understand this. And so it's going to take a little bit of history, but I will hopefully explain this to you at a really high level in the next 5 minutes so that you have a much better understanding of why the banking liquidity crisis is again rearing its ugly head, and it's something we're going to see in the news and have to deal with. And in fact, already are dealing with the first bank, New York Community Bank. So let's talk about 3 of the 4 largest bank failures happened last year in March, in the big spring, winter and spring of 2023. And the Federal Reserve very quickly, once again, did not allow anything to fail and came out and created a new FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee facility, and that was called the BTFP, the Bank Term Funding Program. Did an entire crashes and taxes on the Bank Term Funding Program and what it is and how it works and when it expires, which, by the way, expires on March the 10th of this year. There's no way they will let it expire, and I'm going to explain to you why. So you have to understand that the CRE, commercial real estate sector in the United States, is the most vulnerable, I believe, that it has ever been in the history of our country. And that is for 2 specific reasons. The first reason is what happened, and really is a demographic shift of our country post 2020, meaning that coronavirus changed the way America works. When coronavirus pushed us into our homes and we kind of got used to working remotely, a lot of businesses said, you know what? Our people don't want to go back to the office. They like working remote. We can work and tweak and fix productivity enough to get it up to a certain level. We can manage productivity a certain level, and we'll be okay going fully remote. So you had businesses go fully remote and just basically say, we don't need our lease anymore. The other thing that you have happen is you have businesses such as mine that go hybrid. And so we work in the office majority of the week, but there's still some part of the week where the work is remote. And that really seems to be resonating with not only employees because they understand the need to be in together for some amount of collaboration, but they also really do like the flexibility of being remote. And so what happens is when you go with a hybrid schedule, you have a situation where the office and the employer can then do a hoteling arrangement and have less space because not everyone has to come in at the same time. So you can have, half of your workforce come in Monday through Wednesday and the other half come in, Thursday, Friday, and then you rotate the groups that do that. And you have everyone coming in 2 to 3 days a week, but you only need half the space because you're not having them all at the same time. So we call this hoteling. And so hoteling is back into the mix of, okay, we don't need as much space for everybody for all the time. So all of these factors have basically done 2 things. They've created urban blight. We've seen a lot of urban centers that are now vacancies of 20+%. But overall, our CRE vacancy rate for 2024 going into 2024 is 19%, one of the largest vacancies in commercial real estate that we've ever had in the history of our country. So now you have this urban blight, people leaving the urban centers or the work centers on a 5-day work week basis. That obviously creates all kinds of problems for the restaurants that were servicing the business community, the dry cleaners, the bars, all of the things that go with a workforce coming into the office 5 days a week. All of that gets changed. But what has to happen is the valuation of commercial real estate goes down. Because you understand that commercial real estate is not like a house where you can say, oh, this house is like the house down the street that sold. And so we establish the property value of your house based on what we call comparables that we appraise within a less than a mile radius or what have you. So your home, your retail real estate is done through appraisal. Your commercial real estate is literally, the valuation is what we call a discounted cash flow model, or we take what the expected rents are going to be and the expected rate of rent increases are going to be over the next 5 or 10 years, and we discount them back to a net present value to give us a true valuation of what the viability is of that commercial real estate. And as people leave and don't want to rent as much or buy as much space, this not only leaves a lot of the space unoccupied, but it also diminishes the total value of the building itself. So from 2020 and the new shifting balance of how people work in this country, we have a real estate I won't say collapse, but we do have a real estate crisis on the fact that the valuations of the commercial property is coming down because the lease projections and the rental rate projections are coming down for all the reasons I've explained. So now you have less fair market value than you had before. So that's problem number one for banks, especially regional banks, because regional banks are the banks that are considered to most understand the local area, and they're most heavily involved in financing buildings in their local markets, regional banks. Now, the second problem that comes into play is the fact that since the 80s, since 81, we've had the fastest rate increases in the shortest amount of time. And literally, it is historic. So now this 2.7 trillion commercial real estate market that we have in the United States, a lot of those properties, 2020 happened 4 years ago, a lot of those properties are coming into a refinancing situation. They have a balloon call payment and they have to refinance that loan. So now when they go into a refinance situation, now we have the problem because the value of the building is now less than what it was when they bought the building and financed it for the first time, and they have a balloon payment they have to refinance. You can't refinance the entire amount of the loan because the property is no longer worth that. And on top of the fact that the property value is no longer as high as it was, so therefore some of their loan might not be able to be refinanced. You also have the cost of capital, at 16x from what it was at 0.25% for 15 years, now at 5.25, 5.5. Now, of course, the market has sort of discounted this by saying, but that's okay because the Fed is going to pivot, has already said they're going to pivot, and they're going to cut rates at least 3 times this year. Even the market wants 4 to 6, that they are going to expect at least 3. So they're trying to say, oh, no, it's going to be fine because the Fed's going to cut. But the Fed, with all of these crazy job numbers that keep coming out, like in January, 353,000 when ADP was 110,000 or less, and the consensus was 180,000. And you have the household survey that completely does not match the actual, and people aren't even completing their surveys anymore. Why? It's just one thing after another. And I'm rambling at this point. So when these regional banks go to refinance these loans, one, they are going to have to take a haircut. And there's no margin for these banks to take this haircut, especially because, as I've explained to you multiple times, banks borrow on the short term and they lend on the long term. And the long-term rates are higher because you're locking up your capital for longer. So therefore, long-term rates are higher. And that is the differential between what the bank borrows at and what they lend at. That is the net interest spread. And that's how they make their money. But we've had the longest inversion in the history of America. Our yields curve is inverted. What that means is that the short-term rates are actually higher than the long-term rates. So here you have banks that are borrowing on the short term and lending on the long term and actually losing money on that proposition because the yield curve has been inverted for all this time. So when you have all this money, all these buildings that are going to go into refinancing at much higher cost of capital, that the bank doesn't even want to fully refinance their loan. They want them to take a haircut because the bank can't afford to take it, but the company can't afford to just pay it off, the differential. You've got a banking liquidity crisis. And also, because the economy is actually in much deeper straits than what is being presented to the mainstream, what you see is that banks have tightened lending standards exponentially. And every recession that we ever have, the pre-indicator is banks tightening lending standards. So you see banks tightening lending standards, you see recession, they always map overlay. So there you go. Banks have tightened lending standards. There's less capital flowing into the economy, less stimulus flowing, less money supply available, liquidity crisis. And this is all, again, coming to a head. New York Community Bank specifically is a regional bank that has a lot of property loans. And what they're trying to say, and what the Federal Reserve is trying to say, is that it's an idiosyncratic specific to New York Community Bank. It's contained because New York Community Bank has a lot of rent-controlled building buildings. And so because there's a double whammy and costs have gone up because of inflation, and yet those costs cannot be passed on, and borrowing costs have gone up because of inflation. And so the borrowing costs cannot be or the increased costs cannot be passed on to the renters because it's rent controlled. So therefore you have a lot of defaults now on these property loans. And you could see that because New York Community Bank started to have to reserve for bad loans or, payments and defaults that they started to see. So New York Community Bank started to reserve for that. You can see the stock market didn't like it. You can see their shares started to go down, lost 60%, multiple days of a rout, 25%, 60%. And then you had, after all of that, Moody's come out and downgrade them this week to junk bond status. So the regional banks have a big challenge with the higher interest rates, the tightening lending standards, the inverted yield curve, and the fact that property values have gone down across the board in the United States because we don't work like we used to after Corona. Now, all of that to say, okay, Rebecca, you said it's going to affect the banking industry top to bottom. It's not just the regional banks. And the answer is yes, and here's why. Because the Federal Reserve acknowledged in 2023 that the FDIC insurance and hard assets backing the FDI insurance pool was wholly insufficient, and basically told the largest banks, and our four largest banks, the first largest bank obviously being JP Morgan Chase, Citi, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, those are our big four, told our big banks that you guys are going to have to contribute reserves to firm up FDIC. And massive amounts of payments are going from the big banks to the FDIC to shore up its reserve status, because the Federal Reserve took out the language in the last meeting that the banking system in the United States was strong. And in fact, Federal Chairman Powell has acknowledged in writing and in interviews that there will be additional bank failures and that the Federal Reserve is expecting it. So this is not something that is not expected. This is expected. The Federal Reserve has admitted it in policy document papers and its interviews that there will be additional bank failures in 2024. And I just want you to understand that it's the large banks now that are going to be on the hook for these regional banks. And that is how it affects the banking sector from top to bottom. We are not going to get out of this unscathed. I am agreeing with Harry Dent. If we see 2024 come and go like 2023 did, then he and I and anybody who understands basic economics and economic theory and policy and what happens when you overstimulate and you can constantly stimulate your money supply without ceasing, and you don't allow your markets to naturally sweep clean the bad decisions of debt and overcapitalization, when you don't allow your markets to fail. 2020 would have been the best opportunity to allow them to fail. We had a global pandemic, so we shut down. Why didn't we allow our market to fail? We didn't. We propped it up, and now we have to keep propping it up. And that, in fact, is the house of cards. When you know that if you have or allow any kind of collapse to occur, that the entire system will collapse, and you can't allow it to collapse. And that is what the Federal Reserve has been following since 2008. And China is the perfect example. China stimulates and stimulates and stimulates, and now they're having to deal with the fact that their market is finally routing because of it. So this is happening, and this is the year it's happening. And I hope that this has been a really good, broad overview of all of the economic and the geopolitical risk, and then specifically the banking liquidity risk that we're facing right now on the edge of spring in 2024. Until next week, you guys have a great week. I hope the Super Bowl is great for everybody, and we'll talk to you guys next week. Take care. Hey.